Some stories don't start with thunder. They start with something small, something so wrong, so out of place, that the road itself seems to stop and hold its breath. That's what happened the night an 84-year-old veteran walked into a roadside bar just to warm his hands and sip a cheap whiskey, and found himself shoved, mocked, and cornered by a biker gang that thought age meant weakness. They didn't know who he was. They didn't know what he'd survived. And they sure as hell didn't know who still owed him respect on that stretch of highway. Witnesses say he didn't raise his voice, didn't fight back, didn't even curse. He just stood there, steady as an old mountain, staring at the floor while the gang laughed around him. But someone in that bar recognized him, the faded military patch on his jacket, the scars on his knuckles, the quiet way he carried the kind of weight only real men ever carry. And that someone made a phone call. 30 minutes later, the rumble started, low, steady, growing. Head after head turned toward the windows as 40 riders rolled in from the darkness, engines shaking the ground, headlights cutting through the night like judgment. They didn't come for revenge. They came for respect, for a debt long overdue. And by the time those 40 bikes surrounded the bar, the men inside began to understand something they should have known from the start. You don't lay a hand on a veteran. Not on this road, not on any road. There's a code on the road, older than any patch, any club, any bar where the lights buzz and the air smells like old leather and spilled beer. A code built on respect, on history, on the simple idea that some men have earned the right to stand in peace, no matter where they are or how old they've become. But sometimes people forget. The night an 84-year-old veteran got pushed around by a gang of younger riders, it wasn't just an insult, it was a crack in that code. The kind of crack that spreads fast, like lightning crawling across a stormy sky. And when word reached the ones who still remembered who this man was, who he had been, the road reacted the only way it knows how. Not with speeches, not with warnings, but with engines. 40 riders rolled through the night that evening, not looking for a fight, but refusing to let injustice breathe. They came because respect isn't something you talk about, it's something you show. And when the dust settled around that little bar, everyone inside understood that some men carry a history you don't touch. If this kind of storytelling speaks to you, consider subscribing and hit the like button. It keeps these roads alive. And if you've lived a road story worth telling, share it in the comments or use the link in the description to send it privately. Who knows? Maybe your ride becomes the next chapter we bring to life here. The rain had only just begun when Walter Briggs pushed open the warped wooden door of Rusty Jack's bar. It was the kind of cold, relentless drizzle that soaked through denim and bone. A quiet reminder that even the toughest men eventually wear down. Walter felt it in his joints, the ache that came from a lifetime of lifting rifles, climbing out of foxholes and carrying brothers who never made it home. At 84, his steps were slower, his breath a little heavier, but his presence still carried weight. The bar greeted him the way it always did, with the low buzz of conversation, the faint hum of neon lights, and the warm scent of wood polished by 30 years of spilled whiskey and stories nobody dare tell twice. A couple of old-timers near the far table lifted their chins in silent acknowledgement. Men his age didn't waste words on pleasantries. Nods were enough. And Walter, as always, returned the nod with a subtle one of his own. He took the same seat he'd been taking since the early 90s, third stool from the right, close enough to the wall to keep his back safe, far enough from the jukebox to avoid the distortion of old speakers. Louise, the bartender, didn't need to ask. She simply poured amber into a glass and placed it gently in front of him. "Evening, Walt," she said. "Evening, Lou." Her eyes lingered on him a moment longer. She worried sometimes, not about his health, but about the world around him. Walt was cut from an older cloth, the kind that frayed slower but tore deeper. Men like him carried history in their silence, and the world had grown loud. He wrapped both hands around the glass, letting its warmth seep into fingers stiffened by decades of winters and wars. As he sipped, he felt the familiar burn reach his chest, melting the cold that had settled there long before the rain started. For a few minutes, everything felt steady, predictable, safe. The sort of peace men like Walter didn't get often and never took for granted. But peace doesn't last in places where pride drinks more than reason. The door slammed open so hard it rattled the windows. Louise flinched. Walt didn't turn. He didn't need to. He had felt that kind of entrance before. Years ago, it came from enemy boots hitting dirt. Nowadays, it usually came from young men who mistook noise for strength. 5 riders stepped inside, dragging the smell of wet asphalt and cheap liquor with them. Leather jackets dripping rain, patches stitched on haphazardly. The kind of patches that meant nothing outside their own small orbit of bravado. They laughed too loud, bumped into chairs they didn't need to bump into, pushed past people who didn't need pushing. One of them, tall, shaved head, a grin too wide for the intelligence behind it, kicked the jukebox as he passed, stopping the song mid-chorus. The bar fell quiet. Louise's jaw tightened. She'd seen their type before, always running from something, always trying to prove they weren't afraid of anything. Men who didn't know what real fear looked like. Men who'd never seen the eyes of a soldier who's just watched his world collapse. Walt kept his gaze on his drink. Not out of fear, not out of submission. Because responding to provocation was a young man's game. And he wasn't young anymore. He breathed slow, measured, the way he had been trained a lifetime ago. The group spotted him almost immediately. The oldest man in the room, sitting alone, minding his business. Easy target. A shortcut to ego. "Hey, Grandpa," one of them called out. "You lost?" Walter didn't reply. The bar shifted. Eyes moved. Everyone waited. Another voice chimed in, closer this time. "Look at that jacket. Think he fought in the war or just bought it from a thrift shop?" They laughed, the kind of laughter that's meant to sting. Louise stepped forward, voice tense. "Leave him alone. He's just here for a drink." "Relax, sweetheart," the shaved-head one said. "We're just having fun." He walked up beside Walter, leaning close enough for the old man to smell the beer on his breath. "What's the matter? Cat got your tongue? Or do you just not like talking to men anymore?" Walt finally turned his head, slowly, calmly. His eyes, glassy, tired, but still carrying the weight of things these boys would never understand, met the young man's grin. And for the first time, the laughter faltered. There was something in that stare. Not anger, not fear, just experience. A quiet warning wrapped in decades of survival, but pride is louder than wisdom. The biker shoved Walter's shoulder, not enough to hurt him, just enough to humiliate, enough to claim the moment, enough to make the others laugh again. But someone in the bar had seen everything, someone who knew what that patch on Walter's jacket meant, someone who understood the rules of the road better than the boys who had just broken them. A hand slipped into a pocket. A phone lit up. A message was sent. Outside, the rain kept falling. Inside, the first spark of a storm had just been lit. Louise had seen fights break out in Rusty Jack's before, the kind that ended with broken noses, bruised egos, and apologies the next morning. But what she saw happening at that moment wasn't a fight. It was disrespect, and disrespect toward the wrong man. She froze for half a second, trying to think of the right thing to say, but the words never came. The bar felt smaller than usual, like the walls were leaning in, trying to get a better look at the storm forming around Walter Briggs. The veteran steadied himself after the shove. He didn't fall. He didn't even stumble. His hand tightened around the edge of the counter, a small but telling motion. Louise saw it. The young bikers didn't. "Sit down, old man," one of them barked, raising his voice just enough so everyone could hear him. "Last thing we need is you breaking a hip." More laughter. Forced, eager. The laughter of men who need noise to feel strong. But in the corner of the bar, a man named Harlan watched quietly. Harlan wasn't old, but he wasn't young either, somewhere in that middle ground where you've lived long enough to recognize trouble and young enough to still do something about it. He knew Walter. Maybe not well, but enough. Enough to know that the patch sewn on his jacket wasn't something a man bought in a thrift store. Enough to know that Walter Briggs had led men through places where these boys wouldn't survive a single night. Harlan didn't step in. Not yet. The road had its ways of balancing things, but timing mattered. He pulled out his phone under the table, shielding the screen with his hand. His thumbs moved fast. Code Grey at Jack's. Old vet, disrespected, 5 punks, need presents. He didn't have to send coordinates. They all knew where Jack's bar was. He hit send, and like a spark on dry leaves, the message spread. Across town, across counties nearby, across a handful of garage shops and private barns where motorcycles rested under tarps like sleeping animals. Some men didn't respond with words. They responded with ignition. Engines roared awake, lights flicked on, doors slammed shut. Rain be damned. Back inside the bar, Walter finally straightened. He didn't look at the bikers anymore, not out of fear, but because he'd learned, long ago, that acknowledging disrespect only feeds it. Louise placed a gentle hand on his arm. "Walt, maybe step into the back for a minute. Just until this—" "I'm fine," he interrupted, voice steady, not angry, not shaken, just steady. The tall biker smirked. "Hear that? Grandpa's got some spark left." Another one chimed in. "Maybe he wants to teach us something. You got wisdom to share, old-timer." Walter turned slightly, enough for them to see the faint scar along his jawline, the kind that doesn't come from bar fights, the kind that comes from wars. "No," he said, "not today," but his tone wasn't submissive. It was final. That's when the shaved-head biker stepped closer, planting his hand on Walter's shoulder again, harder this time. "Big mistake," Louise gasped. Harlan shifted in his seat, ready to intervene if things got worse. But Walter didn't react, didn't flinch. Instead, he closed his eyes for a brief second, like a man remembering something painful but instructive. Outside, faint at first, came a rumble. The bikers didn't hear it. The bar regulars did. Louise's eyes widened. Harlan exhaled through his nose, slow and relieved. The shaved-head biker noticed the shift in the room. What are you all looking at?" The rumble grew louder, closer, deeper, a sound like thunder too organized to be weather. One by one, heads turned toward the windows, then headlights, dozens of them, cutting through the rain like blades of white fire. Engines revved in unison, shaking the glasses behind the bar. "What the hell?" one of the young bikers whispered, voice suddenly tight. 40 motorcycles rolled into the gravel outside Rusty Jack's. 40 riders dressed in black and steel. 40 engines humming a promise. Not anger, not revenge. Balance. Harlan slipped his phone back into his pocket and stood. "Boys," he said, stepping forward, "you just invited the road." The bikers looked at each other, the first hints of fear cracking through their bravado. The shaved-head one swallowed hard, trying to find the confidence he'd had moments earlier. "Who the hell are these guys?" he asked. Harlan walked past him toward the door. He didn't look back when he answered, "They're the men who don't let veterans stand alone." He opened the door, and the rain-soaked thunder of 40 riders answered for him. The door swung open, and the rain howled into the bar like it had been waiting for its cue. Harlan stepped outside first, letting the storm hit him in the face. It wasn't the cold that raised goosebumps along his arms. It was the sight unfolding before him. 40 riders lined the gravel lot, bikes idling in low, synchronized growls that vibrated through the ground. Their headlights cast long beams through the rain, cutting across the parking lot, slicing through the darkness. It wasn't a gang. It wasn't a club. It was something older, a network of men who didn't forget who had carried them, trained them, and bled for freedoms they now enjoyed on 2 wheels. Men who remembered Walter Briggs. The riders didn't move, didn't shout, didn't threaten. They just waited. Inside the bar, everything froze. The shaved-head biker hovered near Walter, but had taken an uncertain step back, as if instinct had finally whispered, "You made a mistake." His friends exchanged glances, the kind where pride starts to leak out of the cracks and regret begins to seep in. Louise didn't bother hiding her relief. She exhaled so hard her shoulders dropped. "You boys," she muttered under her breath, "have no idea who you messed with." Walter didn't stand immediately. He finished the last sip of his drink, placed the empty glass on the counter with care, and pushed off the stool. His knees complained. Decades of hard miles had left their signature in every joint, but when he straightened, he stood like a soldier again, not young, not fast, but forged. He looked around the bar, not at the men who had mocked him, but at the ones who had stayed silent, not blaming them, not judging, just taking stock of a world that had changed more than he had. "Walt?" Louise asked softly. He nodded once. "Time to go." The bikers who had pushed him earlier stepped aside subconsciously, as if gravity itself had shifted in Walter's direction. He walked between them slowly, his boots tapping the wooden floor like a slow drum beat. Just as he reached the door, the shaved-head biker muttered, "You think those guys are here for you?" Walter paused, just enough for silence to stretch. "No," he said. Then he lifted his gaze, meeting the young man's eyes. "They're here for what's right." He didn't wait for a response. He stepped outside. Rain poured down in sheets, soaking his jacket instantly. The cold didn't matter. He had seen worse weather, in deserts, in jungles, on nights lit by fire instead of headlights. The thunder of engines greeted him like old friends. One of the riders, large frame, grey beard, leather vest heavy with history, stepped forward. "Evening, Colonel." Walter flinched at the title. It had been years since he'd heard it, years since he'd let anyone speak it aloud. "You didn't need to come," Walter said. "We don't come because we're needed," the man replied. "We come because we remember." The group behind him rumbled in agreement, not with voices, but with machines, a choir of engines. Inside the bar, the 5 younger bikers pressed against the windows, watching through fogged glass. Fear sat heavy on their shoulders, dragging them downward. "Should we go apologize?" one of them whispered. "To him?" another asked. "No," the third said. "To them." But apologies weren't what this crowd was here for. Harlan stepped out onto the porch and leaned against one of the wooden beams. He crossed his arms, rain dripping off his sleeves. "You boys inside," he called out, not shouting, just loud enough for his voice to carry through the open door, "have a choice to make." The shaved-head biker swallowed hard. "What choice?" Harlan nodded toward Walter, who now stood at the center of 40 bikes, rain running down his face, looking both fragile and unbreakable. "You can learn what respect looks like, or you can find out what disrespect costs." The statement wasn't a threat. It was a truth, delivered the way the road delivers all its lessons, cold, direct, unavoidable. One of the younger bikers stepped forward hesitantly, then another, then the rest, until all 5 stood in the rain, shoulders hunched, clothes plastered to their skin. They approached slowly, like men walking toward a judge. Walter watched them come, not angry, not triumphant, just present. He didn't say a word. The shaved-head biker opened his mouth, searching for something to anchor his apology. But before he could speak, the grey-bearded rider stepped forward. "Son," he said, "a man's age doesn't make him weak, but your ignorance, that almost did." The young man's eyes dropped. We're sorry," Walter finally spoke. Not loud, not soft, just steady. "You don't owe me an apology," he said, "but you owe yourselves a lesson." Behind him, engines thundered approval. The rain steadied into a cold curtain, thin but relentless, slicing down through the beams of the motorcycle headlights. The 5 younger bikers stood shivering beneath it, not because of the cold, but because silence had suddenly become heavier than the storm. 40 riders, all still astride their machines, watched them with expressions carved from years of hardship, brotherhood, and battles fought both on and off asphalt. Walter didn't move. His presence alone said enough. The grey-bearded rider, a man named Donovan, stepped forward once more. Rain dripped from his beard as he looked the shaved head kid in the eyes. "What's your name, son?" The young biker hesitated, glancing at his friends as if hoping one of them would speak for him. "Evan," he finally said, barely audible through the rain. Donovan nodded slowly. "All right, Evan. Here's your first lesson." He pointed toward Walter. "That man survived things you can't imagine. Things grown men break under. Things none of us will ever fully understand." Evan swallowed hard. "We didn't know. That's the second lesson," Donovan replied, stepping closer. "You never know. Not out here." He tapped his chest. "So you respect every man as if he's earned it." "Because most have." One of Evan's friends shifted nervously. Another tried to wipe rain from his forehead, though it only made him look smaller. The bravado they'd carried into the bar had washed away completely. Walter exhaled long and slow, his breath fogging briefly in the cold air. "Wasn't about me," he finally said, voice steady but subdued. "It never is. It's about the code." Harlan approached, his boots sinking slightly into the gravel. "And the code is simple," he added. "You don't prey on the weak, you don't disrespect the old, and you don't touch a man who's given more of himself than you'll ever be asked to." The 5 young men stood in silent agreement, shame hanging on their shoulders like soaked jackets. Evan stepped forward an inch. "What do you want us to do?" he asked, his voice trembling, though he tried to hide it. Nobody answered immediately. The storm did. Thunder cracked far off in the hills, a deep rumble that rolled across the sky like the growl of something ancient. The headlights flickered slightly, their beams bouncing off the wet gravel. Donovan tilted his head. "You'll ride," he said. Evan blinked. "Ride? Where?" "Not where," Donovan replied. "With." He swung a leg off his bike, boots splashing into the mud. He lifted an extra helmet from the back and handed it to Evan. "You're gonna follow us tonight. Every mile, every turn, no talking, just listening. And maybe, if you're lucky, you'll start to understand why the road has rules." The other young bikers frowned in confusion. "Do we go with him?" one asked. Harlan stepped between them. "All 5 of you." The group exchanged uneasy looks. This wasn't punishment in the way they expected. It was worse. It was responsibility, accountability, brotherhood offered instead of withheld, and a chance to become something better than the fools who staggered into Rusty Jack's an hour earlier. Walter took a slow breath and walked toward Donovan. "You don't have to do this," he said quietly. "I'm not asking for—" "This isn't for you, Colonel," Donovan interrupted gently. "This is for them." He gestured at the 5 young riders. "And for the road, because the road needs better men than the ones they've been." Rain fell harder, striking Walter's jacket like thousands of small reminders that the moment was real, not memory. Evan finally gave a shaky nod. "All right," he said. "We'll go." Donovan smiled, not warmly but approvingly. "Good, because there's one last thing you boys need to understand before you ride with us." He leaned closer, the rain hissing off his shoulders. "You messed with a veteran tonight." He paused, letting the words sink in. "A man who's lived through hell. A man who's buried brothers you'll never meet. A man who fought so you could be stupid enough to regret it later." Evan closed his eyes. Donovan stepped back. "And he forgave you. That's the only reason we're talking right now instead of cleaning blood off the gravel." The young men stiffened, humbled into silence. Finally, Walter spoke, barely above a whisper but firm. "Learn from this. Don't become the kind of men who need to relearn it." Donovan nodded toward the bikes. "Mount up." And one by one, the 40 riders kicked their engines into life, a thunderous symphony that transformed the night. The 5 young bikers approached hesitantly, climbing onto their machines like men entering a church. Tomorrow, Their lives would be different. Tonight, they would ride with giants. The engines rose together, 40 deep, resonant growls shaking the soaked earth beneath them. The rain turned to mist as heat rolled off the machines, drifting upward like smoke from a sacred ritual. The 5 young bikers hesitated for only a moment before mounting their own motorcycles, suddenly aware that they were stepping into something far larger than themselves. Donovan swung onto his bike with the ease of a man who'd lived half his life on a saddle. He shot a glance at Evan, firm, expectant. "Stay on my wheel," he said. "If you lose me, you don't just lose the ride, you lose the lesson." Evan nodded, jaw clenched, hands trembling slightly on the grips. Harlan, already astride his blacked-out cruiser, revved once. "Let's move." The formation shifted like a school of steel-coated animals, graceful, deadly, disciplined. Walter watched from the porch, rain dripping down his jacket, his expression unreadable. He didn't join the ride. He didn't need to. Tonight wasn't about him. This was a rite of passage, a recalibration of respect. The lead bikes rolled out first, headlights slicing through the wet darkness. The rest followed, falling perfectly into staggered formation, except for the 5 younger riders, who hovered awkwardly at the rear, unsure of their place. Donovan slowed beside them. "Back row," he said. "You'll earn your way forward." They understood. The road stretched out ahead, a long, winding artery cutting through the hills. Rain slicked the pavement, reflecting the lights like molten glass. For miles, the only sounds were the engines and the distant rumble of thunder crawling along the horizon. Evan had ridden bikes for years, but never like this, never in silence, never with purpose, never surrounded by men who rode like their engines were telling stories he couldn't yet understand. Every mile stripped another layer of arrogance from him. Every turn reminded him how small he still was. Up ahead, Donovan raised his hand and pointed to the road. "Lesson 1, Donovan's voice crackled through the rain, though he wasn't shouting. "A rider's strength is measured not by who he can intimidate, but by who he can protect." The words hit Evan like a punch he didn't expect. They rolled through the hills in a perfect wave of headlights, rising and dipping along the dark curves. The 5 young bikers began to feel themselves sinking with the rhythm, the breathing of the engines, the pulsing of the road, the silent discipline of men who'd ridden more miles than they had years. Another hand signal from Donovan. He slowed his bike until the entire formation mirrored the pace. "Lesson 2, he said. "Brotherhood is earned, not claimed." The 5 young riders glanced at each other. Their jackets had been decorated with patches, symbols they wore like armor. But beside these men, these true road keepers, their patches meant nothing. Ahead, the rain eased, thinning into a cool mist. The storm drifted off toward the mountains, leaving behind the scent of wet asphalt and pine. They reached a long straightaway where the sky cracked open just enough to reveal the faint glow of stars. Donovan pointed upward. "Lesson 3. The road outlives us all. What matters is the mark you leave on the men who ride it after you." Evan felt something in his chest tighten, not fear, not regret, but humility. A weight settling in the right place. They rode on. 5 miles. 10 miles. 20. At one point, Donovan signaled for the group to pull onto the shoulder. 40 bikes lined up neatly, engines idling like patient beasts. Evan and his crew dismounted, confused. "Why are we stopping?" one of them whispered. Donovan stepped off his bike, boots crushing the wet gravel. "Lesson 4, he said. "A rider never rushes past the places he needs to remember." He gestured toward the edge of the road, where a small wooden cross stood beneath an old pine tree. A helmet rested at its base. Flowers, plastic but cared for, leaned beside it. A memorial. The young bikers grew still. Harlan stepped forward. "Brother of ours," he said quietly, "taken in the rain 20 years ago. Same road, same storm." The group bowed their heads in unspoken tribute. Evan swallowed hard. "Is that why you came tonight? Because of him?" Donovan studied him for a long second. "No," he said. "We came tonight because of you." Evan's brows knit. "Me?" "You crossed a line," Donovan said, "but you stepped back from it. Men have been forgiven for far worse, but only if they choose to change." He placed a hand on Evan's shoulder, not heavy, not punishing, steady. "Lesson 5, he said, voice low but powerful. "A real biker doesn't ride for pride. He rides for honor, and for the men who carried it before him." The engines rumbled in agreement, like a chorus of approval from the road itself. Evan stared at the cross once more, then at the men around him, then at the dark stretch of highway ahead. Something inside him shifted, quietly, profoundly. When they mounted up again, he didn't ride like he had earlier. He rode like someone who finally understood the weight of two wheels. They rode back toward town in a long, disciplined formation, 40 bikes humming like a single living machine. But this time, Evan no longer clung awkwardly to the back of the group. Donovan motioned once with 2 fingers. Evan moved up, not to the front while he wasn't ready for that, but closer. Close enough to show he was no longer an outsider, close enough to feel the weight of the road and the men around him. The storm clouds drifted off into the distance, taking the thunder with them. The night opened wide. A dark velvet sky stretched over the long ribbon of wet asphalt. The moon broke through, pale and solemn, lighting their path like a quiet spectator. No one spoke, but no one needed to. For men like them, silence wasn't empty. It was agreement. By the time they reached the outskirts of the town, the bar stood waiting in the distance, its neon signs still flickering, still buzzing like a dying firefly. The parking lot was empty now, except for one figure sitting alone beneath the rusted awning. Walter. He hadn't gone home. He'd waited, not out of fear, not out of pride, out of something much older, the stubborn sense that unfinished business should never be left overnight. The engines grew louder as the group approached, then softened like a wave, pulling back into the ocean. One by one, the riders lined up, forming a semicircle around the bar. The young bikers parked last, hearts pounding but steady. Walter slowly stood, adjusting his jacket as if preparing for something he'd accepted long ago. Evan was the last to dismount. His legs felt heavy, his throat tight. He'd rehearsed a dozen apologies in his head, each worse than the last. Donovan walked to his side and murmured, "Don't talk yet." Evan froze. The older riders parted, and Walter stepped forward. Rainwater still clung to his sleeves, and his boots tracked small puddles beneath him. He looked at Evan with an expression that wasn't anger, but deep, exhausted disappointment. That hurt more. For a long moment, the only sound was the soft ticking of cooling metal as 40 bikes settled in the night air. Finally, Walter broke the silence. "You boys think you're tough," he said, voice low and cracked. "But toughness isn't what keeps a man alive. Respect does. And tonight, you had none." Evan swallowed, hard. Walter looked down at the ground, then out at the long line of riders who had shown up for justice, or maybe mercy, or maybe both. "When I was your age," Walter continued, "men taught me with their hands, with their boots, with the road. They weren't gentle, but they were fair." He lifted his eyes toward Evan again. "You're lucky, kid. These men didn't come to break you. They came to bend you back into shape." The weight of those words hit harder than any fist could have. Evan stepped forward. His voice trembled, barely audible. "I'm sorry." Walter shook his head. "Don't say it." Evan froze again, confused and ashamed. Walter pointed to the motorcycles behind him. "To them," he said. "You want forgiveness? Ride right. Live right. Show it on the road." It wasn't rejection, it was instruction. Evan nodded slowly. For the first time that night, Walter softened, just enough to let the truth slip through the cracks. "You remind me of someone I knew," he said quietly. "Hot-headed, lost, thought a loud engine made a loud man." He paused, a long breath. "He didn't make it. Don't be him." A hush fell over the group. Somewhere inside the bar, a light flickered, but no one moved toward the door. Not yet. This moment was bigger than beer and broken pride. Donovan stepped beside Evan, placing a hand on the young man's shoulder, firm, guiding, almost paternal. "He'll fix it," Donovan said to Walter. "We'll make sure of it." Walter gave a single nod, slow, deliberate, and stepped back beneath the awning. Not forgiven, but not condemned either. Evan turned toward the lineup of riders, the same men who had surrounded the bar, the same men who had taught him what fear and respect truly looked like. One by one, they gave small nods, not approval, not acceptance, but possibility, a promise that he could earn his place. Evan wiped his eyes with the back of his glove, embarrassed, until he realized the older men weren't judging. They'd seen worse. They'd done worse. They knew the road broke boys before it built men. Donovan started his engine again. A low, steady thunder. "Lesson 6, he said. "A man's apology is measured in miles, not words." The riders mounted up, engines rising like a storm returning to life. Evan hesitated only for a moment, then he climbed onto his bike, heart heavy but clear. When he twisted the throttle, he didn't hear rebellion or arrogance or anger. He heard direction. He heard purpose. He heard the beginning of a different kind of rider, the kind who earns the patch, the kind who honors the road, the kind who never forgets the night a veteran stood his ground and 40 bikers showed up to hold him accountable. The engines faded into the night, disappearing down the long highway like a rolling storm moving toward the horizon. But Evan didn't follow them this time. Not yet. His bike idled beneath him, trembling like it sensed the weight in his chest. He watched the taillights shrink into red sparks, swallowed by darkness. Then he turned his gaze back to the bar. Walter still stood under the awning, arms crossed loosely, his breathing steady despite the long night. The neon sign above them flickered, humming in the quiet that now stretched between the two men. The rain had stopped completely, leaving only the smell of wet earth and exhaust hanging in the air. For the first time that night, Evan took a real step toward him. Not as a tough guy, not as a biker, not as someone trying to prove anything. Just as a young man trying to understand the kind of person he wanted to become. Walter watched him approach, but didn't move or speak. He didn't need to. The silence was an invitation and a test at the same time. Evan stopped a few feet away and removed his helmet. His hair was wet with sweat, his face pale from the weight of everything he'd witnessed. When he finally spoke, his voice cracked. "I didn't know who you were," he said. "I didn't know anything." Walter tilted his head slightly. "You know enough now." Evan nodded slowly. "Yeah, I do." The old veteran's eyes softened, but only by a fraction. They held the depth of years lived hard, and the quiet sorrow of lessons learned too late. "You remind me of myself," Walter said. "Back when I thought the world owed me understanding. Back when I thought loud meant strong." Evan didn't answer. He wasn't sure he could. Walter stepped closer, the porch light casting long shadows across his lined face. "You don't owe me an apology," he repeated, "but you owe yourself a direction. A man chooses who he becomes every time he turns that key." Evan looked down at his hands, still trembling slightly. "Do you think I can fix it?" Walter breathed out slowly, almost a sigh. "No man fixes everything," he said, "but he can choose not to break what doesn't need breaking." The words sank into Evan like stones settling in water. Heavy, necessary. Walter reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out something small. A metal pin, old and worn, shaped like a simple eagle. The edges were scratched, the color faded. He held it out. Evan froze. I can't take that." "It's not a gift," Walter said. "It's a reminder." Evan swallowed. "Of what?" Walter closed his hand around Evan's, pressing the cool metal into his palm. that the road doesn't care about your past, only your next mile. Evan's breath caught in his chest. He closed his fingers around the pin, feeling the weight of decades pressed into a piece of metal no bigger than a coin. Walter stepped back. The moment was over. The lesson was given. Go home, kid. Sleep. Think. Tomorrow, choose better. Evan nodded, jaw tight, throat burning. He turned, wiped his face with the back of his hand, and mounted his bike. When he started the engine, the sound wasn't defiance. It was humility in the shape of a motor. Walter watched him until he disappeared around the bend, a lone rider heading into the dark. The sun rose slow and pale, warming the wet ground left behind by the storm. Walter sat at the same stool in Rusty Jack's, sipping his morning coffee, quiet as always. The door creaked open. Evan stepped in, no bike jacket, no bravado, just a notebook in his hand. He approached Walter, carefully, respectfully. "I wrote something down," he said, "not for you to forgive me, just for me to remember." He placed the notebook on the counter. 5 words written alone on the page. "Earn the road. Every day." Walter stared at the words for a long moment, then nodded once, the deepest gesture of approval a man like him could give. Evan didn't stay long. He stepped back outside into the morning light, a different man than the one who'd walked in the night before. Walter watched him go with a small, rare smile. The road had spoken, the boy had listened, and somewhere, miles away, 40 riders carried the rumble of a brotherhood that had just grown by one. Because respect is not taught in shouts or fists, it is learned in silence, under rain, on long roads that show a man exactly who he is and who he still can be. Some stories don't end, they settle, in the dust on your boots, in the hum of your engine, in the quiet moments between 1 mile and the next. Evan never forgot that night, not the rain, not the shame, not the 40 riders who showed him that brotherhood isn't a jacket you wear, it's a weight you carry. And he never forgot the old veteran who didn't raise his voice, didn't raise a hand, but raised a standard. In time, Evan rode differently, more aware, more deliberate, more honest with himself. Some men learn from pain, some learn from loss, but the lucky ones, the ones who change, learn from the men placed in their path at the exact moment they need a lesson. Walter Briggs wasn't a legend. He wasn't a hero. He was something rarer, a man who walked the road long enough to become part of it, and long after that night faded into memory. Riders passing through Rusty Jack's could still spot the small wooden cross by the old pine, and the fresh flowers left beside it. They never knew who placed them, but the road did, because the road remembers every mile, every mistake, every redemption, and every man who decides to ride better than he did the night before.